my workshop on world building motions. So that'll be, we'll be focusing on this house prefers a world and this house regrets. So the alternate title for this is How to Have an Imagination 101, because I don't think anyone in debate fucking does. Cool. So 1, don't be boring. There is a current meta in world building motions of nothing change except the way that people perceive themselves. Great. You all know how to run that. It's super easy. Just say nothing changes and then be like, that's because people just think about themselves in the same way, but then they perceive themselves slightly differently and that's where the change is. That's boring. I'm not going to teach you how to do it. If you need to do it to win a debate, great, but it's not an interesting way to debate, so I'm not going to teach you how to do it. Secondly, right, if you're trying to have an animation about specifically retrospective motions, historical motions, try to remember why things actually happen and how things connect to each other. I.e., right, like, there's a bunch of things that happened in history that are all connected to each other all the time, and there are a bunch of reasons why things happened. So when you change one thing in that link, try to think where that's going to go. I'm going to bring you through all of the steps to figure that out. I think also, don't be afraid to make a vague claim as long as you can back it up. Again, this is where knowledge of historical context is incredibly helpful. This is where you don't just case file things that are happening now, you case file why certain things happened in the past, why people interact in certain ways, because that means that you'll be more able to make these claims. Finally, a note on this house hopes. This is almost certainly going to be cut from the manual, and if it is not cut from the manual, there are going to be major changes. So, I'm not going to talk about it. Think about these as forward-looking supports motions. Just think about, there's a world in the future where this happens. Do I like it? Do I not? Great, cool. It's going to change. It doesn't really matter to this. Cool. So first I'm going to bring you through some pitfalls. These pitfalls are things that if you just don't do these things, like the majority of world-building motions that you debate, you will just win because you'll be the only team in the debate to remember that it's a world-building motion. So thing number 1, don't forget to characterize the alternative world. Don't just debate this house prefers a world as a this house prefers debate. Don't just debate this house regrets as this house opposes. An alternate world is a key part of that sort of motion, right? But more commonly, I think, you forget to characterize the world from the start of when the motion is possible. So in a lot of cases, that's the beginning of time. But I want to note here, and this is incredibly important, this house prefers a world motions manifest from the moment when the motion could manifest, not always from the beginning of time. This is a really key mistake that I see people make a lot, right? So this example here, this house prefers a world in which computers all have hyper-intelligent AI automatically installed, literally can't exist from caveman times, can't exist in the Victorian era. It has to exist from like 10 years ago max, right? So you can't just be like, but from the beginning of time, this did this, this, and this for those sorts of motions. But this is also something you can weaponize. So, for example, in Durham Round 3, the one on this house prefers a world in which wealth is considered shameful, thank you, Sharon. What Adam and I ran was that you can only consider something to be shameful if you understand what it is in the first place. I.e., we were able to frame out the idea that wealth doesn't exist at all because you need to know what wealth is in order to consider it to be a shameful thing. So this is the sort of thing that you can also weaponize. Another pitfall is forgetting to prove why your characterization is likely. So this is where you should be doing a good deal of mechanization in your speech. You should be focusing on proving why things are going to happen. Generally, in a this house prefers a world debate, I would assume that a first speaker isn't doing quite as much of the strategy. They're doing a lot more of the literal world building. Another one is making too big a change without considering what knock-on effects could be. We'll go on to that later. And then finally, and this is the problem with all debates, you can prove everything in the world, but if you don't tell me why it matters, you've lost. Great. You prove a different world exists. Cool, thanks for the little lesson. I liked it, but you still lost because you didn't impact it. Cool. So, what I'm going to bring you through are the steps for creating a counterfactual. These are steps that you are probably going through in prep time in about 3 to 4 minutes. I'm going to take you through them in the hour and whatever amount of time that I have. You're going to do several exercises, so be prepared to be very interactive. There's an exercise for every one of these steps in this workshop. So, step 1, when does this change take place? Step 2, what could the presence or absence of this motion cause throughout history? We'll be looking at those two together. Step 3, what actors are most affected by this changed world? Step 4, what knock-on effects could occur as a result of this change? Step 5, and this is really important, what stays the same? And step 6, why is your counterfactual the most likely? Cool. So, steps 1 and 2, some tips and tricks. Firstly, think about the wording of the motion. Right. Could this motion have feasibly begun during caveman times, or does it have to start later? Does this talk about a specific concept that you just are you need to be clear on when it started, when it's going to be relevant? Second, think about the status quo. This is a really good way of thinking about this, right? What does our current world look like, and what can you link to what the motion would be changing? So in the, and we'll use this one several times because it's the only one in my head right now, in the example of the wealth being shameful one, what happens now when wealth is not seen as shameful, and how do we think those things would change? Third, again, I'm gonna say this a million times, don't forget to consider historical context, but also don't just assume that all prejudices, all biases are going to remain the same. Don't assume that the world develops in the exact way that you want it to. You need to prove why there are specific things that will change, specific things that won't. I.e., right, if you're going to talk about how women are treated, you need to prove why they're treated actually better in this world and they don't change the way that this is. Or you can talk about the idea that maybe women are treated amazingly in this other world and there's no biases, and you need to consider that because that's a way that your CG in theory could outframe you or your closing. So we're going to get into a exercise. I'm going to split you into 4 groups. I'm going to time you for exactly 7 minutes. I will make you stop. Group 1, we're going to look at this motion, okay? So group 1, we're going to talk about what this motion does from caveman times through medieval times, approximately. Yes, we're done.
Just to clarify, are we assuming that up until the period in which your history is talking about, the previous times are interacting?
Yes, for the sake of this, yes. So caveman times through medieval times, Victorian / early modern period, 1800s, early 1900s, modern era, right? So for this and only this, we will assume, as Verdun said, that the motion is coming into place in the time that you're talking about, not how those motions actually work, but this is the purpose of thinking about how this could affect things. So, going to split you into groups. What's the... Okay, so... Summer... Okay. I'm sorry, I don't know anyone's names in this room. I'm so sorry. Can I get... you 4, so in a straight line, but not including Matt, yes, and then, great, 1, 2, 3, 4, go over there. All right, you're going to be with the group of 3 people right behind you. Freya to Mackenzie, but including, what's your name? Frederick, your group, and then you 5. So, but I'm going to do this opposite. 1, 2, 3, 4. You are group 4. I've got an opposite. So group 1, group 2, group 3, group 4. I'm going to time you.
Yeah, we're not.
I'm sorry, I really should know. We're just doing. What are you doing for? Oh, okay, let's do the. Oh, it sounds like Booga Booga. One for wife. Oh yeah, what proposition I see, right?
It's just what changes. It's not, is it good or bad? It's literally just what changes are being made.
I think probably changes could be relationship with God will be seen as transactional more, so it's you have to give something for what to be transactional. No, it's actually they're all in the
it's not very, for example, as for my notion, because that's transactional, basically you can negotiate for your own like your
I sacrifice something to be the
No, because Cayman times you have to like put the needle and look down the bank.
I think almost.
I also think that's like stuff would be far harder to put out. Or like power structure would have to give the people benefit more than the power structure to maintain the legitimacy or because comparatively the power structure it seems just having an essential right to ownership. But when the power structure is required to own something.
So like for example, like there are parts in where people like represent to own like actually all the people and like have all of the rights to them. But it basically like in for example in the like relationship was basically just transactional. It was basically like some people being submissive for like the because of her, whereas the people who actually kind of tell us that the different structure very basically like some sort of like social contract structure where basically in order to for example you providing the services and you providing some sort of like infrastructure for the people and
this is the period in which before that people had relationships with nature as well. So it's the relationship with nature.
Say now. So I was asking you, and you're going. Say now. I'm adding you to a group. Okay. Join group 4.
I think it's the essentiality between some change
I think there's something about when you see it is harder for you to see it as like your inherent ownership I'm not sure how hard it is
You're just thinking of changes. It doesn't have the positive and negative.
So if we see all these relationships.
What is it? Zainab just keeps saying every time Zainab waits until the day before the flights, like 20 good flights for discount, and I'm not this year. What just happens in the so I don't know, the Iron Age, the Bronze Age, the Roman Empire, oh yeah, we do the liberalism comes about
or actually like assuming like in many societies like for example like society or like relationship but it was more like good in terms of like motivation where communication don't reach out and therefore this kind of like relationships. I think here actually like in terms of people who are able to understand the because they are really funding.
The premise of transactions is that someone has something to offer someone else, but the premise of that is that the self is things that have ownership that can be traded or sold for other members. So I think the concept of the individual as an autonomous object can come about far faster in society where like relationships themselves are seen as like
But maybe you just like pick and choose who you're transacting with, like, or who you have a relationship, right? Because like, I guess if it says relationships is transactional. People don't see interaction with slaves, for example, as relationships. That's not the thing.
No, but that's the thing. I think the idea of properties is setting something out because it's still a relationship with a person. Like it's relationships with objects are still relationships. So you still have to get a certain good out of it. But I guess it needs to be like
But
self-justified.
in the past, the moral idea was that they are objects. Like they're not
I
moral.
think there's also influencing because I think that this notion that even with minutes is rich people see relationship as transactional, like they might not realize that they see specific different relationships running different levels, and then basically then I think that we want this is the change right now is seeing this as person as like nothing. So
No,
There's more of how this lies to that person and it's going to be applied and it's not just for there's so many cultures that work out
Do we never domesticate the dog?
All right, I'm going to have y'all stop.
These are nicer.
All right, amazing. I'm going to just go through each group. Can one person in, let's say, a minute, like maximum a minute, please tell me some changes that you think we'll make. I'm going to type them down just so that we have them in the future. Group one.
So firstly, you can probably talk about the different sorts of relationships that take place. Given this is the period in which like the statehood and like asymmetric power relations were about, I think you could talk about the ways in which kings or those sorts of societies have been different and why the actual essential ownership as far as they come about, especially as you now have to justify your rule in some specific way to the individuals on the ground. Probably relationship with religion also changes to some extent because there's still the relationship with God, which is now more likely to be seen as transactional. And I think you can apply this to every other aspect of the way in which people engage with the world at the time. Given this was the period where people were coming up with concepts of ownership or how we relate to the world, it then meant that things like nature or even things you probably saw as objects at the time, like perhaps slaves, for example, these are still things that you're now able to form a reciprocal level of aspect to, which probably also means that you might have certain ideas like individuality occurring faster because the premise of transactionality is that an individual has something to provide to another individual. So you probably get that better faster occurring. Probably during the
Great,
Roman
thank
age.
you, that's time.
Probably never domesticate the dog.
Yeah, no dogs happening.
Great, okay. Group two.
We thought the most sort of unique thing about this period was probably like the Industrial Revolution and sort of early capitalism forming, and we mostly focused on that. So we thought that on like the best thing to sort of round off to think about was bosses would see relationships as more transactional, so they might be more willing to give back to their workers a little more. Even if you don't buy that, workers would see the relationships as more transactional and better be able to understand that they are owed something or they are owed more, and better able therefore to essentially take action about it. So they're more likely to want to or be able to organize, unionize, and in some way sort of use their collective power to work at better quality of life for them, to better pay or better conditions in some way.
Yep, all right, great. Group three.
Okay, cool. So I think the main thing that was like unique or distinctive about this time is sort of all the like new imperialism stuff, sort of like colonies forming throughout the world and all of that. And I think where this becomes interesting, also like abolition and stuff happening then, is just, I think what changes meaningfully is the rhetoric and how people talk about things. Insofar as like, if you're a slave owner, you talk about, oh, I feed the people who I put to work, I give them clothing and shelter and all of this, and this is how you frame your actions as moral. Whereas abolitionists, for example, would not be pushing against slavery on the basis that it's immoral, but would be saying that there is a lack of reciprocity, perhaps, that is occurring, and that's why the system is unjust. I think that whether you're gov or you're op determines who you think actually like gets to manifest their change most meaningfully. But I think this is just where the change happens.
Hi, thank you. And group four.
Yeah, so we had a few different things, and some of which are actually quite similar to what's been said already. We had lots of stuff on employment, which is very similar to everything that Ray already said there. In terms of other things that we spoke about, first of all, for some new like romantic relationships and feminism and stuff. Essentially, the fact that women do a lot of unpaid, unappreciated labour, so everything from raising kids to having kids in childbirth. And if this relationship is seen as transactional, then you can actually put a little bit more value on that side of the transaction. We're talking about friendships perhaps not being as genuine and deteriorating a little bit as well. We got a bit about marriage and when that does and does not change, in that I think marriage still fully exists as a concept, because you do get transactional marriages, and we talked a bit about arranged marriages and that sort of thing, which can be sometimes more explicitly transactional, and so there's potentially more of a move towards that as well. Those are the reasons why people do get
Alright.
married.
Yeah, that's fine. All right, that's great. All of you have given some like great examples. I found it interesting. I want to note that a bunch of you go in this direction, that you all went until largely group 4, went in a very similar direction in where the changes are occurring, i.e. a lot of people went workplace, like et cetera. Group 4 is the first time that romantic relationships came up. I find that interesting. I think that's helpful because most people who look at this motion are going to think of this in the situation of romantic relationships. So I think it's good that we both addressed the romantic relationship aspect of it, but we also thought about it in ways of how relationships can exist outside of just that. I think that you all did a good job for the most part, thinking about things that could change on both sides of the house and how those could be positive or negative. I think that's something you should keep thinking about as we go through this. So does anyone have any questions on steps 1 and 2 before we move on to step 3? Great, amazing. So step 3, which is which actors are most affected by this changed world? The tips and tricks, cool. So you need to think about all relevant actors to the motion. This is where we talk about the idea from the last thing of think about workplace relationships, the way in which political relationships happen. Think about romantic relationships. So this is, I want to add a note to this. Think about the ones that aren't obvious, but also then don't skip the ones that are obvious, right? So make sure that you are thinking about all levels of the actors. So on that last one, think about romantic relationships can win you the round, even though they may seem more obvious. So can all of the other relationships you guys talked about. You just want to make sure you're thinking about all of the relevant actors. Second, you'll want to think about actors in historical context, i.e. if you can prove that life gets better for one group of people in a specific way, you can often weigh this really well within the debate by explaining how these groups are affected as time goes on, right? So even if life is terrible for women because of some motion from caveman times to Victorian times, but there's some reason why you can prove that their lives get better after that, and you can prove those knock-on effects, that's incredibly important, right? So you need to think about them in historical context, think about when and how these motions would affect specific people. We're done?
So in these sorts of motions, the obvious, it feels like simplistic in the most strategic point is to go as far back as you can, because then you can analyze the very beginnings of the change and how that influences on work.
Yeah.
But a lot of the time is credited because it's in this too hyper or being a bit too wishy-washy.
Yeah.
Is there a specific period in history do you think it would be the easiest to intercept, or do you just think it should be done like a case by case?
I think it's generally case by case. I think that there are going to be some motions, honestly, with that, I'm using that last one as an example, but like you guys talked about, a lot of the changes that you guys talked about were a lot larger scale. I think that a lot of times it's easy to start from a place where it's like everyone kind of knew who was being marginalized at the time and like how this could change, that sort of thing. Not quite the Stone Age, like Victorian era, Elizabethan era, oftentimes easy to think about it in that time period. But the other thing I want to note on that is that when you guys are thinking about starting from as early as possible, the way I literally imagine it in my head is I have a caveman couple. How does their relationship change? Just them. Just these two cavemen. Because then it helps you get down into, it's not just this huge societal change, it's also interpersonal, which is often a lot easier to prove as to how people interact with each other rather than the whole world changes in this way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but you said it before that like you could use the actual descriptions of the words of emotion.
Yeah.
Be like, oh, people didn't understand wealth as a concept, and so we cannot debate before that.
Yeah.
Does that mean we should take the point at which people understood relationships as relationships?
In that situation, I'd say you should probably, I wouldn't go as relationships, I'd go as transaction. When people understand the concept of a relation, of a transaction and of like people interacting in a way that is a give and take, that's the point where you can probably start that motion. You can also just start it from the beginning. Don't do what I was talking about before unless it's going to benefit you. If it's not going to benefit you, ignore it. No one else is probably going to think about it that much. Then finally, a lot of this is repeating myself, but this is just, I think, incredibly important. You just can't assume that actors are going to be innately the same thing, the same type of people in the alternative world. You have to characterize why they either stay the same or change. We're gonna have a like a part of the workshop on that later, but you need to be very careful on characterizing the way in which people interact with each other, the way in which actors present themselves. Cool. So we have another project. This is another 4 group one, so I'll keep you in the 4 groups, but this is the last time I'm doing the group thing. So yeah. So we'll have this exact motion. This house prefers a world where wealth is seen as shameful. So we're going to keep the same group numbers, and you're going to think about how they affect your specific actor. Like how does this motion specifically affect the actors that you are carrying, that I've assigned you. Don't try your absolute best not to think about outside of that. Cool? So just think about it that much. I will give you 7 minutes. Please discuss.
Yeah. They probably feel better because they have less employees.
Yeah, because they're like little doing rocky shit. I also think like
I think some marginal communities would end up forcing as well. So predominant powers push concepts of wealth above them. So for example, the Jewish people, because they get constructed wealth just due to the religion. So there's something like some POCs are because they are technically wealthy but don't have the levers of power. They're even more. I mean, they still get fucked with cash flow, but they're even more focused on announcing like immoral POCs. Yeah. Well, I mean, that is true. That is true. If there was like 2 rich people, the POC rich person would always be considered the worst of the 2 because of the way that like you'd be able to put out narratives around it. Like a healthy rich person is.
I don't have to stick with the emotions because I have to say we apply or like into this group of people.
No, but the point is like unmarginalized groups can control what is seen as a just amount of wealth better, or just the amount of capital better. So you can be like, this white person deserves to hold this amount of capital because it is a necessary thing for them to run the company. Whereas as marginalized groups, so it's easier to like oppress certain groups because of what they did. I mean, it does also make so there's like I guess there's 2 different types of marginalized communities. There's ones which are rich and ones which are poor. The ones which are poor are pretty good.
know,
Probably
business.
like.
Like, it would only be comparative if that would happen. Whereas in status quo, POCs that are rich, they're being doing something more better than the
Status quo is not something that as a witch but it's more just like or you can say certain times there are different goals set for different communities and you are different. So when a slave gets access to a certain level of goods, you see it as more shameful because you think this is wealthy relative to class they should actually be. So the essentialist attributes of these marginalized communities are still characterized by the level of wealth they actually have. You're right, it's probably a bit wishy-washy.
I don't know, bro. No, we're only doing
So much.
For example, in like, basically, like, back to things like commerce, basically,
you don't sit there and you're like, instead your articles something
I guess actually there's probably less of a
Oh, that's true. Oh, okay, that's the easier thing. It's just such an easier thing. We care about the easier things because it's harder to oppress people. Like you can't like slavery only came about because of the fact that people try to treat you well and help you like you to like
that's finally one crack history. Well, my intuition is like,
sorry, I just stopped listening to anyone to get more insights.
it's harder for like kings to legitimize having like wealth that tons of costs is unnecessary. So maybe they'll still have it like believe in the power. Yeah, but no, what I mean is they can't legitimize having like 200 concubines. Like that live like 250 wives. That's like WTF.
Other things still play well. Yeah, this world keeps dicks as soon as we're we're getting recorded.
Yeah, no. I cut it out.
Alright, time. Okay. I'm going to mix up the order because it doesn't matter because there's nothing that really connects to each other. So group 2, you're starting. You have a minute.
Well, we've got a few things. First, that maybe you change the direction that children want to take with their careers and otherwise. We can kind of see that going either way, depending on what side of the motion you are. It's in either it's that currently we see wealth as pretty neutral, so we may actively shameful. Children are less likely to take pragmatic careers and home life for their children and their own families and whatever else. And then also you can vote the other way, that now children are more willing to actively pursue things that they enjoy because they don't see shame. They don't see wealth as some sort of obstacle for doing so, whereas existing in the status quo may become a problem where people only want to go to careers that are lucrative. And then similarly for parents, either it gives them more guilt because now they feel like any wealth they accrue to them will be back to their children eventually, or less guilt because now they think that even if they can't give their children material luxuries, they can at least give them the benefit of virtue by not giving them wealthy, good luxuries in their youth.
Yep. Cool, great. Group 1.
So we talked about why it's like harder to oppress people if wealth is seen as shameful. The reason for this is like kings and other people can't justify doing things in the pursuit of wealth in a world where it is seen as something that is noble, or in a world where it's seen as like something that's cool or necessary. So you probably do like less transatlantic slave trade, which is probably good for some POC. You probably can't justify having like 300 concubines for no reason. That's probably like good for WGM and things like that. On the flip of it, we talked about how existing essentialist power structures probably could still exist, and like discrimination towards a WGM POC. So the change in this motion is probably like when one of them is wealthy, they're seen as comparatively worse than the white person that has also accumulated the same amount of wealth. Like, you know, like vilification of like kings of Mali that were really rich, or like the House of Saud in Saudi Arabia and stuff, and why that could make it worse for POC because they're seen as the cash grabbers or the hoarders of all the resources in the world, because it gets worse because it's shameful.
All right, cool. I forgot to time you, but I assume that was about a minute. Group 3.
So we kind of envision this as like Nordic countries versus like Dubai, where people are happy to flaunt their wealth. And we kind of modeled it in that way. So we thought there'd probably be actually more stuff on a societal level. That's just because people are probably going to be wanting to donate more if they're rich or part of the ruling class. That's to say there's going to be probably a bit more of a donation culture, or maybe they'll appreciate your wealth slightly more. Even if it's very showing and is like a version of carbon offsetting for the wealthy, this will probably still have some big impacts. More than that, it means that they're probably going to have to pay more taxes. Why? Because these people, the people who are ruling the country, are going to be able to pander more on a level that's like, hey guys, or at least in democratic nations, hey guys, wealth is kind of shameful, so we're going to divide it up so that way people have like less wealth. So they're probably going to be taxed more. So in these countries, you probably have like greater taxation, and I guess divided up more, and that's probably just good for everyone. So that was kind of the model we had. Then proving the internal stuff and how their like mindset changes is slightly harder because you've got to prove that they actually internalize this, and I just don't think this happens. I think like cognitive dissonance is probably what wins out here. Like lots of people buy items from Shein that are like, no, child labor is terrible.
Yeah. Okay.
We're not sure where the delta is on that, but like the other stuff probably makes sense.
Yep. That's good. And group 4.
We talk about how probably people still have that incentive to actually make more money to make their life easier, because they still want to make sure that they do not live below a certain level. And probably that's a bad choice, because that means that people are less willingly to talk about their salary here, which probably entrench the exploitation that exists in the workplace right now, since people may have not so transparent negotiation stuff. And we also talk about how probably there are still structural barriers to prevent them from earning more money. That means that even if probably they're not there, they will still have that sort of gratification in terms of seeing themselves as less shameful. And finally, it's kind of similar to the group 3's one, because we talk about how probably they would feel like if those people were on the top, they are someone who's very shameful, so they would be more likely to go out there to have more union movement, to call them out and advocate for more policy in terms of taxation, and we would have more expansions from the middle class.
Yeah, this is good. Okay, so the one thing I want to note, and this is interesting, so this will go for the rest of the workshop, is a lot of you guys didn't analyze from the beginning of when this could possibly have started. A lot of you did some really great analysis on how this affects today, how this affects now. I think the really important thing to remember is you're adding these steps together, right? So take steps 1 and 2. You need to start from the beginning. Always start from the first time this possibly could have been a thing, and then go from there. I think that all of the examples you gave are really, really, really good, and I think that they're all potentially debate winning. Just remember that when you're in this sort of debate, the biggest possible mistake you can make in a world building motion is to forget that it is retrospective. the number of debates I have won by getting up from closing and saying the entire debate has forgotten that this is a retrospective motion, I'm just going to prove to you that why this matters historically, is like, I actually can't count the number of debates I've done that in. So just remember that it is a retrospective debate, because that's incredibly important. But I think that every argument you made could have like been even more bolstered by a retrospective view on the world. You just have to think through those sorts of things. Cool.
I have
So
a question.
yeah, absolutely.
So I think sometimes, like at least when I've done this debate before, there's an issue like when you do like retrospective things about how capitalism was formed, because you have to weigh up like humanity's incentive to just like develop and get better at things versus like this narrative of wealth being shameful.
Yeah.
So how do you like say that from like, the dawn of time like things would have changed, like maybe capitalism wouldn't have gone the way it does? Because how do you put this narrative wins out over like incentives just to make things more efficient?
Well, that's a debate. So I think that the way you do this in a lot of ways is, if that's what you want to run, which I will admit that it is incredibly high burden to run capitalism doesn't happen. But if you do want to run something like capitalism doesn't happen, I would soften it just a bit to say capitalism doesn't get as entrenched as it is today. There's probably still the need for bartering. There's probably still the need for this person has a milk farm and this person has a wheat farm, and we need to come together to make bread and we need to trade things. But you probably don't have as much of a thing of trying to build up the amount of wealth that, like, I'm not going to hoard all of my wheat, I'm going to give it out a little bit. I don't need to get something in return for every single thing, which probably means over time you're more able to say there's like a softer version of capitalism that's more of like trading rather than like hoarding the wealth at the top and that sort of thing. On the alternative, you can absolutely argue capitalism still happens to almost the exact same extent, because you can say people's mindsets probably don't change to the extent where they don't end up, say, in a famine where they need to hoard all of their wheat, and then they think to themselves, oh no, my family needs to hoard all of our wheat from now on. And so that like accumulates, and then you do have the thing of accumulating to the top. I think that this is like two counterfactuals that you'd have to weigh in that world. And I think you could, depending on the weighing that you give, you can weigh one above the other. We'll also get to weighing a counterfactual is most likely at the end. So we're gonna go on to step 4. Step 4 is what knock-on effects could occur. When I talk about knock-on effects, I mean there are parts of you are making an argument and you are focusing on a really specific part of your argument. That may not mean, however, that there aren't a bunch of other things happening in your argument, right? So if you, like I say, if you pin your argument on a specific premise, you need to be aware of the effects outside of your argument that the premise could create. Cool? So like, if you're like, this is gonna make life so great for all these women, but then you realize like halfway through your speech that actually all the gay people over there are getting absolutely fucked. This could really be exploited, right? Like you need to ensure that you are aware of the knock-on effects of the premise that you are creating. You need to be aware of how, like, of a broader range of effects, right? And you just need to think about which knock-on effects are likely to come up in the debate, right? So I am not saying stand up there and be like, and here's every possible effect of everything that could ever possibly happen ever. Ignore all the ones that aren't gonna matter. Think about what your opponents are likely to be able to exploit, and if you think that they are unlikely to exploit it, or you think it probably doesn't matter that much, don't address it. I think you'll be fine. You can just ignore some of them, but some of them you should head off, and if at all possible. If there is a detriment to what you're doing, you should be able to head that off. Any questions before I get to the exercise? Cool. So this is going to be slightly different. I've given you a motion, and I've given you an argument. I want you to think for like a minute, and then I want people to raise their hand to tell me the answer to these 3 questions. What premises do this person's argument rely on being true? What are some reasons why these premises may not be true? And what knock-on effects are the team ignoring so that they can make their argument? So think for a bit, and then think for 30 seconds, then I'll call on people. I'm not going to call on you randomly. I'm like, raise your hand. Does anyone have any thoughts on, you can answer any of these 3 questions, or even if you have a similar question that you would like to answer yourself, you can feel free to answer that as well. Adam, then Iman, then.
So the premise about violence marginalization is basically relies on the fact that basically these these communities that come together and rules themselves, like either there will be actually like inclusive and basically all people have similar power, or I don't know, or it could be also that basically all the basically people of different like races would be live completely separate and therefore would not basically be influenced by either of these, because and if you do not prove this, then you might actually still have like marginalization because still simply some people in the community have more power.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Iman?
No, I was to say exactly the
Just
same.
that. Sorry, you were raising your hand. What's your name? Sorry?
Sadia.
Sadia, yes. And then.
I was going to say it relies on the premise of the racial majority not being, willing to take their arms up and, I don't know, form a group called KKK and do violent organization themselves. Also that, at least the second bit seems like it's almost trying to say that the police force are the reason that people aren't judged fairly, whereas I think all of the issues surrounding marginalization of a group are probably the reason why people aren't judged fairly. And it doesn't say how getting rid of the police is going to change any of that.
Yeah, Summer then Leanda.
I was basically going to say the same thing with just assuming that, this means that people will actually work collectively and not form, lawless militias. But I think it also kind of rests on the assumption that there wouldn't just be a new system of police in general, whether that's more like community support, neighborhood watch idea, or like we were kind of saying militia or something like that.
Yep, exactly. And Leanda?
I think it's broadly kind of a similar claim, but it's just more that this analysis is kind of contingent on the fact that police are the ones who are the significant perpetrators, and not that they are a representation of an existingly racist or discriminatory society. And insofar as they fail to address the core issues, then OG don't really have an argument.
Yep. Anyone else want to add anything? Zainab?
This is maybe kind of a bad take, but I just think the knock-on effect of this is things probably do become less safe. I'm not saying the police are good, but I don't know if another form of enforcement of law or rule is going to be actually good at protecting people. There probably are lots of people that do rely on police for protection, right? Women rely on them. Lots of other marginalised groups probably do as well. So
yeah, I do think you need to weigh that in debate. Yeah, I'll take people who haven't yet. So Kate, then Frederick, then Cyrus.
I think it seems like the implicit failure in this team's argument is a lack of framing as to what the justice system looks like, because things that police have to do are say collect evidence, do it in a very specific way. So there's no indication. They'd have to bring out to us how this centralized police force would actually institute justice.
Yep.
Well, and kind of building on that and what was previously said, the idea that police currently does not adequately deal with the racial injustice does not mean that there isn't the capacity to do so. Because if the society's racist, the police will also be racist. But by completely removing them, you get even more, because the chance that a racist crime isn't investigated, maybe it's not, but it could be. So subsequently, you're removing even more protection, if you can call it that, with possible protection, I suppose.
Yeah, and Cyrus, did you have anything?
This argument is premised on existing in a time and place where societies are racially diverse and well organized. Most of human history, they're quite homogenized. So there isn't enough racial diversity for discrimination.
Yep, I think that's all correct. And I'm in, and then I'll move on.
Yeah, a knock-on effect of misses out is so it says that people would enforce rules, but it doesn't say what rules or how the rules accrue. And I think there's a lot of historical evidence to suggest that it's not just rules come and then police enforce them, but police enforce some rules and then feedback and say that other rules should exist and therefore rules come into place. So rules themselves would be different, and they just kind of ignore that.
Yep, that's exactly the one thing I was waiting on to say. At no point did they say who comes up with rules and and what rules happen and what rules are important. Maybe these rules are fuck the people who are marginalized. If those are rules, great. Second half of the argument works, but the first half is terrible. Great. So you guys understand how one case here, which seems, on its face, it's simplistic. We can assume they've proven some stuff, right? But a case about this then has knock-on effects that could not only badly affect the people who they're trying to defend, but also create more weaknesses in your case as you go on. Are there any questions on step 4? Cool. All right. Step 5, which is what stays the same. And I think this is incredibly important because I think that you have to note in a lot of these debates that that one thing changing is unlikely to change the literal entire course of history and everything's going to be different. I will say there are going to be things that are going to be like more likely or not they're going to stay the same, but most of this is up to the debate. Most of what changes, most of what stays the same is just you have to debate whether or not it does that, right? Like, yeah, so again, if your argument relies on improving situation for marginalized groups, you just need to be incredibly careful on like, but what things stayed the same that could impact this? i.e. with this police situation, maybe the police aren't there, but why are marginalized groups marginalized in the status quo? Is it because of the police? Probably not entirely. Therefore, you need to be in a situation where you're thinking to yourself, why is this the thing that makes it better? So what I recommend in this situation is you choose one thing that gets better, and then you explain why that one thing gets better and weigh that out. Not, there is going to be no more marginalization and everything's awesome. It's, this lessens marginalization to a certain extent. This increases access to a certain extent, and so then you're able to weigh that out as like, this is ultimately a good thing, even if it doesn't fix things forever amazingly. Finally, you need to think about incentives. Incentives is incredibly important. This came up a lot with the wealth situation, right? With the wealth motion, right? Because can you argue in that the incentives of people to gain wealth stay the same? That is up to the debate. The idea of gaining wealth to be wealthy or gaining wealth to have comfort, you need to debate whether or not those incentives are likely to stay the same under both sides of the world. So you have to think about, is this one change enough to actually change these incentives? Where do the incentives actually come from? i.e. with the wealth situation, I would argue that you probably don't start from the idea of I'm going to be wealthy just to hoard all my piles of gold. You probably start from the idea of I want to be comfortable. Now I want to be more comfortable. Now I want to be more comfortable. Now you go up, right? So where do the incentives actually come from, and which incentives are likely to change or stay the same? Before I go on to the exercise, are there any questions on what stays the same? Step 5. Awesome. So this exercise, this is a whole group activity. This motion. So here are some things that could change or could stay the same. I'm going to ask people to raise their hands to tell me why something changes or why it stays the same. That is the whole exercise. So choose one of these 5 things that based on this motion could change, could stay the same. And I want you to argue to me, actually specifically, why it doesn't change.
Sorry, this house or?
This house regrets.
Regrets, thank you.
Which side are you on? I guess it doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter. Cool. Adam and Kate?
Can I start?
Yeah.
So I would say that basically levels of colonization, I would say basically treatment of the Native Americans. Why? Because you can basically explain that the American dream developed probably later, probably in the 1920s and that, and therefore like after basically the most like genocide and explosion was already occurred, you then have to prove like American dream is particle like associated with like the 20th century. You can say that it was basically in the 20th century the rise of the middle class, where even like average people could like afford like to own land, to have house, to have like lots of consumer goods, and based on that they developed their own identity, and therefore after that already like the native people were really marginalized, already were like forced into relegation, and therefore not much things like changes afterwards.
Yeah, that's very good. Kate?
So the wealth and power disparity in the US doesn't change because there are already existing counter-narratives within American culture that could also be exploited to support an unequal society. And say, for example, if there's not a concept of an American dream, then your society is probably more likely to accept an idea of being unequal anyway, because if you aren't teaching that meritocracy exists, then you don't have to justify why it appears not to, but also because a lot of Americans are deeply Christian, I think you could also justify this idea that maybe you haven't earned your wealth under the American dream, but maybe it's a Calvinist kind of idea and God approves of you. That's something that exists in American culture, so you still have disparity.
Very good. Leanda?
I think kind of furthering onto that, I think the American dream is the most like confirmation bias narrative that can ever exist. Because what it tells you fundamentally in its like nature is that one black president outweighs like 100 black lawyers, and insofar as this is a dominant narrative that exists, you're just not likely to get a change in the disparity of power.
Yep. Good. We're done?
I guess if you want to argue that things do change for the wealth and power disparity, you would argue that other ways to hold power structures can rely on a bunch of different things, but the unique benefit of the American dream is that it does put the onus upon the individual to act in a number of ways. And I guess you can just weigh why those few individuals on a larger scale of time acting does lead to, even if it doesn't mean that like wealth changes a lot, it does mean the average person probably gets significantly more wealth. It's like free market capitalism if you want to go down that line.
Yep.
While the wealth incentives still exist for military expansion and basically American hegemony, the American dream is massive on how many military bases there are, because this idea of America is number one in our narrative, or the American narrative is the right one. I think you get a significantly less involvement of America on the world stage in a military perspective, and maybe, not to the same extent, but more isolationist country, maybe less involvement in Vietnam or China, the Cold War, etc. has a big, it's totally different.
Sure. Okay. Iman, then Freya, then Summer.
On the frontier movement, like there are probably some like cringe incentives about how moving westward is probably just economically good. But I actually think it would have happened anyway, and not because of the American dream, because like moving westward is like really pretty, and I would like to get on a horse and do it. So I actually just think people for that reason would have done it.
Absolutely. Also, I'd go in the order I just called, so it was Freya, then Summer.
I think sort of counter if you want to other thing that levels of colonization by the USA say the same. I think if you have that wealth and power disparity, a lot of people in power who are sort of effectively making these decisions aren't that affected by the American dream, because it's largely sort of this confirmation bias thing that affects sort of the lower middle class, saying you should pick yourself up by the bootstraps. Whereas although it may be said that the people at the top did that, they didn't, they got grants, right? I don't think they're that affected by it, and I think decisions that will be made where it's a military decision that this is good for the economy, this is good for gaining more wealth and things, would just still happen.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry.
So it's a bit abstract, and I'm not even going to try to take on the for-profit part. Just looking at like the American healthcare system more broadly, I think that the American dream sets a culture of individualism and self-sacrificing, which I think then has extenuating impacts on people's view of their health, especially in regards to occupational health and what they're willing to sacrifice to be able to get from the bottom to the top. And I think that has implications for not only the way that people prioritize their own health, but then also the approach of the healthcare system, making it then more preventative to be more, oh my god, what is the word? I'm forgetting where to say it. Like to work better with the American dream to facilitate people working from the bottom to the top by preventing any health health disparities that would be able to do that.
Yeah, I'm going to ask specifically for someone to say why the for-profit healthcare system will not change.
Makes too much money.
People like money, and therefore.
You can also, I think here, if you look at argument and circle thing, that basically here basically firstly there were no institutions which would in the first place set up a government healthcare system, because for that you need probably basically because before that you need, for example, I don't know, some strong unions which might not necessarily here emerge because necessarily emerge because there was no distribution of organized revolution, or there was no, or simply you do not have this societal thing of reciprocal relationship with workforces, for example, existed in Catholic countries with the development of Christian democracy in Europe. So therefore, because you have this more just individualistic focus on yourself, be self-sustainable, which was already there present in the culture with some Calvinism, it might still lead to less government intervention and less healthcare system.
Yeah, that's good. Tom, and then we're gonna cut and go to the next one. Yeah.
Sort of more on this idea then, the US has lots of sort of media hegemony, and they're able to disseminate the idea of the American dream, and that oftentimes went to Europe, and then lots of Europeans who didn't have that much social mobility in Europe moved to America, which had more comparative social mobility. So lots of a flip on the working class is just to say working class people are better off in America than they are in Europe, and the reason they moved is because of the American dream.
Yeah. Cool. So you guys are hilarious, because about half, more than half of you talked about why things would change, which is great, because I like that you're having an imagination, and that's awesome. And I think that that is very, very, very good. Just like, remember, part of the reason we do this is because one of the things you're going to get is you're going to be on this motion or whatever, and Gov's going to run that. You need to prove why none of that actually happened. You need to have the capacity to say, actually, this thing, and this thing, exactly as some of you did, don't change at all. Here's what would change, and here's why that's bad. So being able to say why things just aren't going to be that different, I thought some of that was very, very, very good. Just make sure that you are like really thinking about that in a lot of ways. Are there any questions on step 5? Cyrus?
This is more just a complex question, but especially if you're trying to prove something, when you're trying things like this are hard to prove, you can have it on scales that are scalar rather than binary, and you don't have to push the tipping point stuff, which you can almost never prove. You can say like half of it gets one better.
Yeah, exactly. Most of this is just weighing out how something gets a little better, and that's great. Adam?
So do you think that if, for example, here with the case of American Dream, I would lose also like, kind of like try to cover spec knowledge into like some reasons why American Dream developed in this period and therefore couldn't influence the things prior. Will churches buy to that, or will they think like, for example, this is just a spec knowledge, so I will rather default to judging the debates based on some more like, common like arguments and common like mechanisms that the team of teams provide.
I mean, I think that with this motion specifically, it is true that the American Dream came into existence at a specific period of time. This is one of those motions that you can't say, the cavemen didn't have the American Dream, that's not a thing. To be honest, what I'd say to you is assume that your judge is not going to buy it, because I just am going to tend to assume your judge is not going to buy spec knowledge. Maybe they will, and that'll be awesome, and I know that you're right, but I would bring in some mechs. Just bring in there's ways to structurally prove why the American Dream came into existence at the time that it did. There was a lot of propaganda about wanting people to like pull themselves up by their bootstraps as part of the Great Depression. You talk about the idea of wanting to go out and explore so that people aren't as crowded over on the East Coast. There's a lot of reasons why that was a thing, and some of it's AIB knowledge, so you can use some of that to mechanize it, and that's what I do. Cool. So I'm going to move on to step 6. Step 6 is, why is your counterfactual the most likely? And this is incredibly important because up till this point, I've basically just been telling you how to come up with a counterfactual. But in a lot of good rooms, multiple teams are going to have a counterfactual. And that's really unfortunate for you, but you need to figure out how to prove that yours is the correct one for the judges to buy, because in most situations, or there are lots of situations where people will just agree on a counterfactual, but in this House Prefers a World especially, you will often not get people agreeing on a counterfactual. You will get teams that are fighting over, well, my world's better, etc., right? So the tips I have are, A, keep it as simple as you can. Don't make the judges follow 10 different logical chains to get to your ideal version of the world. It shouldn't take a lot of explaining to say how do you get there, but you do need to prove how you get there. A huge pitfall in these sorts of debates is saying, this world is going to do this thing, and then forgetting to do any of the stuff about why this world is going to do this thing, and just assuming that that's accepted by the debate. It's not. The judge will just not give you the win because, like I say, you're just playing a fun pretend game with no analysis. This is great, but not debate. Again, impacting. None of this matters if you don't prove why your alternative world causes something important to the debate. Don't forget to impact. Also, and this has gotten me a couple times, don't spend your entire speech proving multiple counterfactuals and leave very little time to do all the other debating stuff. This has happened to me in a lot of debates. Some debates I've just gotten lucky and been the best team in the debate anyway. Some I haven't gotten as lucky. Choose a counterfactual, do what you need to prove it. I do expect a lot of mechanization, especially from first speakers with this sort of debate, but then don't do just a bunch of stuff and do none of the weighing, none of the impacting, none of the anything. Cool? Finally, think about the way that human beings actually work. So why are people likely to respond to the motion the way that you want them to, and does historical precedent back this up? If you're talking about the way that people respond to each other, you need to talk about why people respond to each other that way. For example, you can't just assume that the conversation that I'm having with you right now is exactly the same in the alternative world. You need to consider how people's mindsets actually change. Iman?
So I've previously heard advice, which is like, if you, for example, if you're on Gov, to just pick the best counterfactual for op, because then firstly you win on it, and that's good.
Yeah.
And secondly, or at least try to. And then secondly, you don't end up in a counterfactuals battle where you try and where the clash becomes about who proves the correct one, and you otherwise just clash on other things. Like, do you think that's good advice?
So,
I think that's weird advice.
I think it's weird advice. So I think there's a version of that advice that is good, which is consider the op counterfactual, but I think if you're spending time coming up with your own counterfactual and also trying to come up with every ideal version of ops counterfactual, you're probably going to spend a lot more time trying to come up with their ideal counterfactual than coming up with your case on how to win on their ideal counterfactual. I honestly think if you know how to present a counterfactual well, if you know how to prove that your counterfactual is right or is good or, you know, whatever, it is probably fine to have your own counterfactual, but I would not, on that, I would not then say, but my counterfactual has everything amazing and no problems ever. Like every debate ever, you have to concede that some things are going to be negative, some things you're not going to win on. Like, unless this is the worst set motion of all time, right? Like, there will be a reason it's a two-sided motion. So I would think about what could be good for op, but I wouldn't sacrifice your counterfactual for op's counterfactual just to like try to win on it. Because I think that you are going to be able to run your own counterfactual better. Cool. So, any more questions on this? One more project and then we're done. Great. So, this project, you're going to be in two groups. Group 1 has this argument, and group 2 will have this argument. I'm gonna just split you right down the middle, so Freya, Ruby. Great. Now what I'm gonna do is each group is going to take turns saying one reason why they think people are more likely to respond in the way that they say.
It's like you take the shitter, but like.
Now I want to be clear, I don't want one person from the group answering every time. So I would like, I guess we can, no, I don't want to make you all stand up and line up and shit.
You should just pick people.
Yeah, just pick
I'm
people.
just going to pick people. But like, if you are like severely want to opt out from that, you can like shake your head at me and I won't call on you.
Can we like popcorn someone else? Like, you can call on me, I'll just be like, Mackenzie, take this one.
I'm giving you the ability to opt out, but like it is really, if you are like, this is going to be the worst thing in the world for me to ever possibly do, I'd like you to participate in this. Cool. So
It was like group 1 or
Group
group
1.
2?
Or group 1, yeah.
Group
It's just
1,
a
group 2.
characterization thing.
Oh yeah.
So I'm going to give you like 15 to 20 seconds to think. So group 1, group 2. I put illustrations so you know how people feel on your side of the world.
Do sharks understand people's emotions very well?
That shark is very happy.
Oh, okay.
That shark is happy and that raccoon is upset.
Yeah, so you look better.
Okay. All right. I'm going to start with group 1. I'm going to start with Cyrus. You actually said yes to that. Cyrus, go.
They probably have tried opening up before, and or tried hiding before, I should say, and didn't work very well, so now they don't hide anymore.
Okay, great. Group 2. Sharon.
Sorry, I need a bit more time to digest this.
This is fine. Ruby, are you ready?
I'm also not finished reading the slide.
Oh, okay. Adam.
What Cyrus said was in reverse. They probably tried being open before and it went badly.
Great. Awesome. Group 1, Adam.
Okay, so basically, when people oftentimes want to express their emotions because they know that it's easier way how to communicate complex feelings without doing so, but at the same time there is some norms or just shyness about not doing that. So actually when you can hide it, it's great because you have motivation to do this. At the same time the motivations might not to do that simply fall away.
Great. Group 2, Summer.
Okay, wait. just remind me one more time. So we're saying why somebody would disagree with our side.
No, why someone would, why is this true?
Okay. Give me a second. Can I phone friend and then come back?
Zainab, group 2, get your.
So this is just like kind of similar to what Anna says, but I think in society there are lots of like shame around emotions, and it's particularly true for like certain groups. So like men, for example, often with shame surrounding like feeling sad or anxious or nervous about a situation because they're told to present in a specific way, and therefore you're likely to like people already repress their emotions in these situations and will probably do that even more so if they're worried that like someone can look up their emotions and see them as like inferior than what they are.
Great. Group 1, Iman.
I think people are likely to be forgiving because humans are naturally collaborative for evolutionary reasons. And the reason that otherwise there's a stigma is because people don't understand the position from where it comes, whether it's like vulnerability or whether it's malice. So in order to be like secure in themselves, they assume the worst of someone else. But if you understand it, then you're going to be forgiving.
Great.
Collaborative.
Group 2, yes.
It's a little half-baked, but with the second point on people want to make less connections with each other, I think when people form connections with other people, it's like you willingly let people know about your emotional state, but the fact is you have that control over doing that, whereas once you start making connections with people, formalities tend to drop, and so people who inherently care about you will probably be more likely to want to look that up because they see it as an act of concern, whereas maybe people feel like they lose control over their emotional state when they then try and let these connections happen, which is why people might be less likely to do that, because at the end of the day you still have some things that you don't share with certain people, but if that individual misunderstands how, I don't know.
Good. Amazing. Group 1, Mackenzie.
I think that for group 2, I think that hiding a physical presentation is kind of all what people currently do already. So I think that like when someone's able to actually look at an emotional state, it probably changes how you behave like surrounding that, instead of being so fully thought about it. When you know that someone's probably just going to look at it anyway, and you're more able to be open about it rather than try to fight them on it.
Great. Group 2, Summer.
I was just thinking like that there's kind of an ethical side of this, kind of along the same lines as like HIPAA, where it's kind of unethical to like force people to have their private information, as in their emotions and any other details that are kind of connected with that, just out, which it looks like this is kind of an open to the public kind of a thing. And then it's, you know, how can a person consent to anybody in the entire world knowing what their emotions are?
Sure. Group 1, Tom.
Humans to evolve to like produce technologies or innovate or be curious have to share their emotions with each other. It's slightly more costly to like properly explain all your emotions, but when you don't have the ability to do that, then narratives begin to arise saying, like, you know, people can't control their anger or people can't control sadness, for example, and therefore that's okay. So when the cost is no longer associated with like hiding your emotions and it becomes more acceptable to have that, then people can be more open when they wouldn't have wanted to before.
Great. Sharon?
Autonomy is important. I think it's a natural aspiration to say you can control what information other people could access about you, and that's within your own autonomy to decide what are the things you are exposing other than the things you cannot control, for example your appearance. So I think from this perspective, cost does not matter because that's an inherent value which people should have, and they should always be able to maintain that regardless of what other people's efforts are.
Cool. I'll do one more from each. So group 1, Freya.
I think we've generally agreed that like repression's a bad thing, and I think even if you're like not more open on our side, like, if you disagree that people aren't more open on our side, you're still going to be more likely to be confronted because people can look up your emotional state, and you get that then like catharsis and talking about it, the benefit of then working through your emotions, which you wouldn't have if you can't look up your emotional state and you're more able to essentially wallow in it and repress it, which we sort of agree with that.
Sure. Okay. And finally, group 2, Leonda.
So, I mean, I think the thing here is just kind of that there might be, like, insofar as narratives around what it is to, like, present yourself in an emotional way probably still exist. I actually think that the comparative here is how you act even with the knowledge that people might look up your emotions, in the sense that like there might still be a societal incentive for you to want someone to be able to look up that you feel sad, but they see you stone-faced, they're not showing your active emotions, and they're like, yeah, that's metal as fuck. And insofar as that stays true, then you're still incentivized to hide your emotions and not actually present them openly as group one would like you to believe.
Yeah, okay, that's very good. I think you guys did a good job thinking about both cases. I think just remember a lot of This House Prefers a World motions are about human interaction and the way in which people behave. Like a bunch of them, you know, This House prefers a world in which everyone believes in God. This House prefers a world in which relationships are seen as transactional. This House prefers a world in which, I don't know, I'm forgetting, like this one, right? It's all, a lot of them are very specifically about the way that human beings talk to each other and interact with each other. So thinking about the way that humans behave, but also thinking about why humans behave in that way, what the psychology is, and what could either change or keep that the same, as we talked about earlier, is really important for motions like these. So are there any questions on any of this, the world building in general? All right, awesome. Good job, guys.